Thank you for braving the weather. I second that. I have three colleagues that I would like to introduce, and before I do, I want to tell you a little bit about what we do. We're an interfaculty initiative at the school, which means that we try our best to be as multidisciplinary in these areas that are quite challenging and really require the interaction of lots of disciplines. Haiti, of course, represents that, and all of you, I think, are very much aware of that. So it's multi-sectoral in the sense that humanitarian response involves shelter, food, water, and obviously healthcare. But also, in Haiti in particular, has presented a challenge for logistics, communications, transportation, all of those things. And so part of what we wanted to do is to bring in some of my colleagues who spent some time on the ground dealing with these issues. And again, looking at sort of a humanitarian history, whether it's conflict or natural disaster or some kind of combination of those, Haiti really represents for us probably the most significant challenge in many ways. It was kind of down that road of a failed state to begin with. They've been devastated by several years of hurricanes. Most of their disaster preparedness had been around hurricanes and floods, not really around earthquakes. The last one was, as most of you know, several hundred years ago. Their healthcare was somewhat marginal. The health system was marginalized. It was a public system that was underfunded. If you look, for those of you who are public health folks, just at baseline, it was a country that had about 58% immunization coverage, and for us that means we get very nervous when we hear that, because that means that's a population that cannot respond well to an outbreak or cannot contain an outbreak. So those are things that were the case at baseline, and less than half of the population had access to potable water, for instance. So this is what we were dealing with at the time of the earthquake on January 12th. And most of you know the logistics problems with getting supplies into the airport, and of course the lack of a port, the fact that the government was essentially destroyed early on, and even the UN presence was compromised pretty heavily. So that is the backdrop. I'd love to introduce my colleagues, and I will say that I will apologize that we all come from a public health and medicine background initially. Don't let that color your thoughts about us. We've all had background in humanitarian assistance in some way, shape, or form over the last 15 years. It's on 15 years, maybe you guys a little less. But anyway. I will also apologize a second time. We've had some problem with the video on Patrick's. So I didn't know if we wanted to give that a try or not. But we weren't going to, Patrick did not want to do the presentation if the video didn't work. And there's a lot of reasons for that. So I may skip over Patrick. And yeah, you want to try it, or is it working?
Yeah, we have one video guy. Is Patrick still here?
It's ready to go. He was a little freaked out that the video wasn't working. And
Patrick, I think we're okay.
All right. Did it? You want to try it or no?
Patrick, I think we have the Mac going. You can either put it on you can actually put it on an external drive, or we can try to hook up your Mac.
Why don't you start, and that way you can take Q&A overnight and kind of set up.
All right, let's do that.
Thank you very much.
Let me introduce everybody at the outset. Brett Nelson is, I've known Brett since he was a med student at Hopkins, but even then he was a very field-savvy guy, was spending time in Kosovo at the time. It was 1999. Looking at the health system both in Kosovo and Serbia. So he's done a lot of work in that regard. He has since become a pediatrician since those days. He's on faculty at Massachusetts General and at Harvard Med School. He is looking at the child protection issues. In particular, he went down with, as our representative, but also with the Francois Xavier Benyu Center for Health and Human Rights at the School of Public Health, to look at a joint assessment around child protection, and I'll let Brett explain that a bit more, because there's some salient issues around children in this population in particular. Stephanie Roster is my colleague at Brigham and Women's Hospital. She's an emergency physician, a graduate here of the School of Public Health, and she runs our International Emergency Medicine Fellowship. She's a veteran of a number of disasters, including Pakistan, so she's used the earthquakes in Kashmir, and Haiti was Haiti was the next stop on her road. It was very interesting for us because we were put in an interesting position once Stephanie and my other colleague Larry Cranmer arrived. There was a real need for post-operative care, and field hospitals were springing up among the different NGOs, and so it has made us somewhat into a pseudo-NGO, well, an NGO. So she'll talk a little bit about both the public health and medical experiences in the early days and what's ongoing. And then Patrick Myers, our fellow. Patrick's amazing. For those of you who are blogophiles, Patrick runs one of the most interesting blogs, iRevolution.com. It'll keep you busy tonight if you're interested. In his spare time, he's trying to get a PhD at Fletcher. He used to work with PRIO, the Peace Research Institute of Oslo, doing work in the Horn of Africa. He's now a fellow of ours and has essentially created networks of crisis mappers. So these are people who look at crowdsourced information and apply it to open platforms and analyze in real time. And so Haiti was essentially for us in the Crisis Mappers Network a crucible for bringing networks of people together around open source data in a disaster. And this is the first time this has ever happened. So hopefully that video will work and Patrick will be able to illuminate that for us. And then lastly, although it's not on the schedule, my other colleague who's also an emergency physician, who's at Beth Israel Hospital, is Dave Galloway, who, and Dave, I know operations...
The Operational Medicine Institute.
Dave is also an ex-military guy. You're still a reservist, aren't you?
I have the card. I'm a card-carrying member.
Exactly, yeah. And also in informatics, and obviously logistics and information management were key components of this early response, and was essentially knocked out, as you know, in the first several weeks. So I'd like to have Dave, I didn't know he was going to be here today, actually comment as well for the team, if that's okay with you. Because I think all four of these areas represent unique challenges to Haiti and this particular type of disaster, which really, in a sense, has it all in terms of challenge for us. So I guess
I'll just interrupt and say there's some people at the back there. There is a little space if you want to sit on the floor. You probably get a better chance to listen than if you're outside the room. So maybe just come in.
I've asked them to each speak for approximately 20 minutes. If possible, I guess, since Patrick will put together his video, perhaps then, Brett, maybe you can take some Q&A right afterwards. And we'll have maybe a short 10 minutes or so of Q&A. Okay?
So thanks. We're really excited to be here and to talk about these issues with you and to have an active discussion. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time and talk about some of the child-related issues, looking at child protection in the post-quake time period. So, but I wanted to first pause and talk a little bit about the vulnerability of children. We all know that children are amongst the most vulnerable populations in disasters and in conflict. You know, they are relying on others for nutrition, for protection, for other services. And this vulnerability becomes even more of an issue, particularly in the disaster setting, where there's loss of adult providers and there's disruption of social infrastructure and services and protections. And then we also fear that there might be a little bit more violence and exploitation in these settings. So, so we're concerned. The model that we used in approaching and addressing the child protective issues is a model that is being developed by Teresa Betancourt, one of our close colleagues at FXB, the School of Public Health. So the SAFE model, S-A-F-E. S stands for safety and protection. A stands for access to healthcare and physiologic needs. F is for family and connection to others. And then E is education and livelihoods. The thought is that all of these components make up the needs of the child, and that we need to simultaneously address all of these needs. And this is a little bit different than what we classically thought of when we talked about needs of an individual. Perhaps you've seen this pyramid, Maslow's Hierarchy. Has anyone seen this before? Okay, good. So you're familiar with this type of hierarchy where the basic needs are frequently first addressed, so physiologic needs of hunger and thirst. Then once those are addressed, then we start looking at safety needs, security and protection, etc., etc. And only after those are addressed do we look at more of the social needs and needs of the individual. So this was more the historic model, and we're more advocates of the SAFE model, where you need to look at safety and protection and education and family and access to healthcare all at the same time. We fear that this type of approach may neglect some of those other issues. So we went to Haiti with the SAFE model in mind and seeing how we can meet the needs of the child. Just as background, you guys know probably a lot about Haiti, and Greg described that certainly Haiti has been in need for decades. Poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. We know that about 80% of Haitians lived on less than $2 a day. 50% lacked clean drinking water. 50% were unemployed. And then the life expectancy in Haiti was only 52 years. In sharp contrast of a 45-minute flight to Florida, where life expectancy in the U.S. is 78 years. And then as far as children go, 1 in 8 children died before the age of 5. And this is just in our backyard. So a little bit greater focus now on children before the quake. As we discussed, they had poor health and economic indices, but they also had very limited access to education. Only 49% were actually attending school, even though on the books, primary education was supposed to be offered to all. Those who did attend were usually self-financed, and so this was a huge obstacle. And then there's a lot of children in Haiti that are in institutionalized care. There are over 500 registered orphanages in Haiti, and then probably at least that many that are unregistered. And when we use the term orphanages, these aren't made up of orphans, typical orphans who lack parents. The vast majority of orphans, over 350,000 orphans in Haiti before the quake, only 50,000 of them had no living parents. So many of these quote-unquote orphans were institutionalized more due to economic pressures that the families were feeling. Unable to care for their children, they would then send the children to an orphanage. Also, before the quake, there were a lot of street children. Just in one study by UNICEF in Port-au-Prince, they found 2,000 street children. And many of these street children were being recruited into gangs and involved in violence and crime, as well as being exploited and abused. Has anyone heard of the term restavek? You have. Okay, so a few of us. You're pronouncing it much better than I am. Thank you. And in fact, anyone care to kind of describe what that means? Please.
It's like slave. It's slavery, basically. I grew up in Haiti, so I know how it is. You underage, and you basically there to take care of your little sisters and brothers, and carry water in your head, or go wash the clothes. You have to. This is how it works, and it's basically it. It's like a slave.
Yeah.
They treat you like a slave, but they don't mean to. It's just the way the country is.
Thank you. We're glad to have you helping us here. So yes, so this is a system where frequently, due to economic pressures, a family would send a child either to a more well-to-do family member or someone in the community that, in theory, would be able to take care of that child more easily. And so, unfortunately, though, in reality, these children become more indentured servants to that family, and they have limited access to education, nutrition, health services. So This unfortunately is incredibly common in Haiti, where up to 1 in 10 children are considered restitutes. Also, there's been a long history of child trafficking in Haiti, with over 3,000 children being trafficked out of Haiti each year. Our fear, of course, is that this is only going to get worse as a result of the unrest, disruption, and the quake. Okay, so as you know, on Tuesday, January 12th, around 5 p.m., there was a 7.0 earthquake, which was just about 25 kilometers southwest of the capital of Port-au-Prince, with resultant huge destruction. There's also been about over 50 aftershocks that have been over the magnitude of 4.5. So you're probably very familiar with the impact. You've seen this on CNN. You've read about this. Some of you have witnessed this. The latest figures out of the government of Haiti, just last week, 212,000 deaths, over 300,000 injured. Over 1 million individuals are now homeless as a result, many of whom are displaced. And then, not to mention the destruction of infrastructure, government ministries, the UN, and schools. Many of the UN and the ministries were these 4- or 5-story cement buildings that were lost, and so we've lost a lot of leaders as well. And on the lower left is a photo of their parliament, their White House, their palace. Okay, so our team consisted of 4 individuals. Tim Williams is one, along with Sajid Balsari and Jane Lemery. And so the 4 of us spent a week there in various parts of Haiti, and our objective was to assess the impact of the quake on child protection and child well-being in Haiti. We spent that time meeting with various stakeholders, over a couple dozen stakeholders, as well as visiting various sites, including orphanages and hospitals and clinics. We worked closely with EBERS, which is the social services out of Haiti, and with UNICEF, who's partnering very closely with EBERS. We were working with the UN logistician base and various NGOs and orphanages. Just to give you kind of an idea of the setting, this is Minusta, which is the logistics base of the UN, where most of the NGOs and UN organizations are working from. There were a lot of meetings, a lot of cluster meetings around health, nutrition. Our particular interest was child protection. And so meetings throughout the day and evenings. Some of the camp was a little less organized. Here we are on the outskirts and sleeping on literally the end of the tarmac with C-5s flying over all night amongst the broken down planes. But it actually became really useful to be rubbing shoulders with all the other UN organizations and NGOs and talking to them throughout the week. So one of the outcomes, or one of the early decisions of the child protection subcluster, was to focus largely on the most vulnerable children, the most vulnerable unaccompanied minors. And so the subcluster decided to focus on these groups as opposed to registering and focusing on all unaccompanied or all children. There's some controversy around that as well. But the most vulnerable groups were identified as unaccompanied minors under the age of 5, unaccompanied minors that are female, unaccompanied that have disabilities, either mental or physical. And that category has actually been very loosely interpreted so that we can try to cover more individuals. And then the recipients who are not living with their employers. This is a very controversial assumption that those who are living with their employers or with their indentured families are better protected than those without. And again, we know that this still puts them at risk for exploitation and abuse. we spent a lot of time looking at orphanages. We went with UNICEF as well as with the Haitian Social Services. Here's a picture of one of our inspections on the left, following and observing those inspections in one orphanage that was fortunately still intact. But there were many orphanages that were not intact, and we visited orphans that were living in tent cities like this, where one little tent about this size housed a dozen children. And our objective was to try to identify the most vulnerable, those that were unaccompanied and didn't have parents or guardians. This is the image throughout Haiti and Port-au-Prince of tent cities that are spontaneously being formed. And you can imagine that this puts the children in these tent cities at increased risk, not only for not having access to nutrition, protection, safety, health services, but also for abuse and exploitation and trafficking. So that's the setting that we fear, and we fear that as time goes on, there's going to be greater unrest and frustration and violence. So what are some of the solutions? Using the SAFE model, let's talk about some of the solutions that our team is working towards facilitating. So S again was for safety and protection of children. Well, fortunately, one of the first initiatives is to establish child-friendly spaces, either within camps or within these tent cities. And so our colleagues from Plan, World Vision, Save the Children have already established over 30 child-friendly spaces that are providing children with safety and daily routines and opportunities for education, sharing, and nutrition. Although these aren't going to be sufficient, so there's also discussion within the subcluster on child protection to establish transient interim facilities. And we make the distinction here that these aren't orphanages, because we fear that orphanages aren't the best setting for children. And so these interim facilities would be used to house and to provide services for unaccompanied and separated children, particularly during these next couple of weeks to months while we're still trying to reunify families and identify these vulnerable groups. The next part of the SAFE model is aid for access to health services and physiologic needs. And Stephanie's going to be talking a little bit more about healthcare there in Haiti. This is one of our very brave patients that we saw at a pediatric clinic one day. And while a lot of focus has been on addressing the health needs of the populations in the last several weeks, there's going to be long-term needs, particularly in the area of rehabilitation, physical therapy, psychosocial care as a result of the trauma and the PTSD that's coming. F is for families and reunification. So there's different organizations looking at tracing and reunifying families. There's been some technologies that were developed. The database up there in the first photo has been developed in other disaster settings. But there's also new technology that's being applied to this disaster. Here's Elizabeth Cody, one of our colleagues from MGH, and they're using a new iPhone app. Yes, there's an app for that, and they are registering patients as they come to Hillary and Stephanie's camp. And this database can then be shared amongst institutions. It also has the ability to capture photos that perhaps with Picasa or iPhoto, you could have facial recognition. So if a minor comes across the border, you could take another photo and link up the information. So there's different technology that's being introduced. We need to educate health providers, those who are manning the clinics and the hospitals and having first contact with these unaccompanied minors, and so that they can help identify these unaccompanied children. And then there are organizations that are setting up efforts at the border to make it less porous, so that fewer of our perhaps well-intentioned Baptist missionaries will cross the borders with busloads of children. But unfortunately, the borders are incredibly porous still. And lastly, education and livelihoods. This is actually the real solution for for many of these problems. The issue of orphans, the issue of restivics, the issue of families being forced because of economic concerns to give up their children. So we need to build capacity within the community, develop programs around microcredit, around sustainable agriculture, and provide people with self-sufficiency. So lastly, I just wanted to share with you one video of just displays just how amazing these people are, how resilient, how full of hope they are. This was as we were leaving, that there was a celebration, a church service going on at Stephanie's camp. So despite everything they've gone through, they're still full of hope and energy, and truly it was a pleasure to meet them. So I think I'm out of time, but do you want to do question and answering?
I would say it's not a presentation, it's three. So unless there's a burning question, I would suggest we move on.
Yeah, I just wonder how realistic it is that the infrastructure for the protection and the care of all of these children can be set up in a reasonable period of time. I mean, compared to the length of dependency of the child, and whether there would be any place for like international fostering or something like that.
It's a good question.
Because I mean, you have infrastructure in place in the UE countries, you have it in place in the United States. If you could get governments to agree to handle their health needs, there would. I mean, I'm talking about fostering. I'm not talking about adoption.
Yeah, I think it's certainly a good question, a difficult one. The fear is that many of these orphans, quote-unquote orphans, truly do have family, and so taking them transnationally across any borders, even for transient foster care, raises concerns.
Yeah,
and
of course,
certainly,
concerns, yeah.
certainly amongst the Haitians, and so a lot of the efforts are even now. Those that were occurring in the DR and the Dominican Republic are now being brought back across the border, trying to keep Haitians within Haiti. I think that's, and using interim facilities until longer-term answers are available, I think, is where the child protection subcluster is going. There's just so many concerns right now about the adoption and I think fostering.
Can we hold that, because I'm sure there'll be other questions on that afterwards. I mean, it's a huge issue, and I think it's an important point to raise, but I would suggest we hold that and come back to it.
There are burning questions.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, it is a burning question. Sure. Okay, should we move on to that?
Yeah, Stephanie, why don't you go ahead and it'll be happy to moment.
Sorry, can I just say that a lot of people still outside. Is there any room there in front of the...
There's people sitting there.
There are people sitting there already.
There's room for one person.
There may be a little bit more space if people want to just get in the room so you can hear. If you can just quickly come in, those of you who want to, because then we can move on. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi everyone, my name is Stephanie Rossborough, and as Greg said, with my colleague Hillary Cranmer, who's also an emergency physician in our department at the Brigham, I was part of an effort to set up this field hospital in Haiti. Hillary and I were in Haiti within 48 hours of the earthquake,
And we were involved in 2 field hospitals. I won't really spend a lot of time on the first one. The first one was a place that we were directed to by some of our colleagues down there who knew about it. It was a field hospital that was set up by a major university medical center very close to the UN compound at the airport. Totally disorganized. A lot of the things that Brett was talking about with child protection were not being attended to. And these were smart, capable, well-meaning people who were doing an absolutely atrocious job from an international human rights and standards point of view. So we worked there for a while, and then for a number of reasons we transitioned after being asked by the Dominican government to set up and establish this field hospital. So I'm going to spend some time talking about this place and how things worked there. What you see here is sort of an overview of the hospital about 5 days in. You can see the mountains in the background. This place is along the road that goes from Port-au-Prince all the way to Santo Domingo. And it's close to the Dominican border. And the reason that the Dominicans asked us to set it up was that a lot of Haitians had sought medical care just in the Dominican Republic at a town called Humanitarian, which is a border town. There were 3 field hospitals there that were set up. There was about 1,000 patients there within a week after the earthquake. And so it was extraordinarily busy. The Dominicans, for a variety of reasons, were interested in having folks rehabilitate inside Haiti, and we took the best of those reasons being to get people closer to home, and ran with it and said, yes, we will come and set up your hospital for you. So we got this call, and we set up the hospital. So Port-au-Prince, you've seen a lot of the pictures. I'll go through this. It was absolutely devastated. If you've been there, you know in comparison what it looks like. It's just the unreinforced concrete buildings, when you shake those, they crumble. And that's basically what happened. In the early days of our field hospital and everywhere else, people were coming in the back of trucks like that. This was a tent city in the middle of Port-au-Prince. But people just needed to get out and they needed to get care, and they were going wherever they could. So what happened with this field hospital was that the head of the Dominican Armed Services landed in a field at an orphanage. This was an orphanage run by a Christian group from South Florida in this particular spot along the road, and they basically saw the compound from the air and thought, you know, that looks promising, let's just land, and asked them whether they will sponsor a field hospital. So this is the Dominican government on the right and left, and then the 2 people in the middle, the guy in the hat and the woman in the blue scrubs, those are Bobby and Sherry. They're from South Florida, and they run the Love a Child Orphanage. And so they came and said, can we establish a field hospital? And Bobby and Sherry said, well, sure, you know, and there it is. And then the tall woman with the white shirt, that's my colleague Hillary, who is still there running the field hospital. So here we were. Stephanie and Hillary are now on the job. You can see when we got there, this is pretty early on, but you see the blue tarps strung between the trees? Basically, those were the first load of patients that were there. And when we got there, there were about 25 patients outside on the lawn. They wouldn't go into the buildings on the property, even though the buildings were quite sound, having been built with reinforced concrete. But of course, the patients wouldn't go inside. So they were outside. And so we basically started from that, and it turned into, within about 10 days, a 500-bed field hospital. We had $1,000 in our pocket at the beginning. And that has been about half spent at the time I left to hire local Haitian staff. Everything else was donated, and all the people who work in the hospital were just volunteers who wandered in, essentially. In the beginning, it looked like this. These are the patients outside on the grounds. This is the initial staff housing. There was the guys in the red shirts are a group from New Jersey. We eventually got some tents. The ones with the little pluses on them are from some Taiwanese tents. I don't know where we got those, but they showed up. And then the tent on the left is our triage tent. What was different about this hospital, and I'm going to kind of zip through the photos and then just give you a few talking points. So the first thing that distinguished this place was that it was very secure. The entire compound was surrounded by about a 10-foot high cinder block fence, and there was one entry and exit. And that made it just about the most secure compound in the country. In fact, we were visited by a number of representatives from different agencies, including the U.S. Embassy in Haiti, who told us, in fact, that it was indeed the most secure place in Haiti. And that was with 5 local guys that we hired to guard the door and kind of take names of everybody who came in. So security was was intact, and that's, I think, one of the reasons that you saw people being so relaxed in the video that Brett showed. They seem to be the healthiest population in Haiti. That was actually mostly family members. Patients were probably in the tents, but people started arriving very early on. You can see that people had these little cardboard splints made up. Those were actually made by the medical staff. The orphanage had sent their trucks into Port-au-Prince to pick people up off the streets, basically, and bring them back. And so people kept arriving like that for the first several days. The other good thing that was great about the facility was that it was sitting on top of a huge, deep, I think it's an artesian well underneath the surface of the place where we were right there. And so these guys had set up a huge water tower, and they were already pumping water from this deep source into the water tower. And so there was drinkable water coming from every single tap in the place, which was extraordinarily unusual. In fact, we could not get the Haitian patients to drink that water from the tap, even though it was perfectly clean, and we were trying to drink it and show them how it was okay, because they'd probably never seen a tap where you could drink water straight from the tap without treating it or otherwise doing something. So that was one of our big public health issues in the beginning. We had this great water, and we couldn't get anybody to drink it, and people were still trying to drink from the donated bottles of water that we had. The other thing that we had initially was sanitation. I'll go back a couple of slides. You see behind the yellow school bus? Sorry. Right behind the yellow school bus, that building is actually a latrine building. It had 25 stalls in it that was built for the school. All the yellow buildings there are the school where we were. And right out behind it, and at the top of the slope area where we had our camp, was the septic tank. And so that was great. So for the first little bit, we were using the latrine building, but the patient load quickly outgrew that, and it was only made for a little tiny school for a few orphans. And so what we discovered one day when somebody finally thought to look in the septic tank was that we were about this far from overflowing the tank right into our field hospital. So we actually had to bolt the door to the latrine building, and we started to get some donations of porta potties. Essentially, we urgently asked for porta potties from UNICEF and a number of other places, and eventually got some. And we had to close it and use the latrines for staff only, just because the numbers were lower and we could message that nicely to the staff and control access. And then we had a range of porta potties set up for the patients. And it got to the point where we had 2 trucks, pump trucks on the facility 24 hours a day, just pumping stuff out of the septic tank and out of the porta potties to keep it clean, because that was a big priority early on. But we were allowed to let the patients go into the latrine building and use the runoff to do showers and personal bathing. So it was a private place for people to kind of clean up, which was very, very nice and very useful. You can see the medical needs. There's Brett, by the way. There's Brett. Brett in the triage tent. So we would get patients, we would ask people to send patients 10 at a time. They would routinely arrive 65, 70 at a time on bus loads from the other hospitals, and so they would just swarm into the tents. And the first step was in the triage tent. I don't know if you can see it there, but here's somebody's bucket. We made up hygiene kits. We got a lot of donated buckets. The head of the Punta Cana resorts in the Dominican Republic, Hillary and I flew over on his helicopter the second time into the country, and so we said, hey, you run a resort, let's have towels and sheets and blankets, and he's like, I can do that. So we had sheets and blankets and toilet paper and soap, and we got somebody to donate thousands of toothbrushes and toothpaste, and we had some of our volunteers just making up these little hygiene kits. So everyone who came into triage got a little hygiene kit. And we also, there's a person in the back, one of our people right here, is in charge of registration. And almost the most important thing we did was to keep a school notebook that had everybody's name in it. Got your name, where you were from, your address before the earthquake, how old you are, all of that stuff, your diagnosis, so that we could get this into a computer system and transmit this information to the ICRC so that they could help to match our patients with the families that they were now scattered away from. Because these people were mostly, in the early days, arriving from another country. They were coming from the Dominican, and a lot of them were coming unaccompanied. So no one was allowed to leave triage before we got them registered. And if we found an unaccompanied minor, they had special care, and I'll talk about that in just a little bit. So this is another part of our triage tent. We had a lot of help, including from the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts. These are the scouts That's what they call them. So the scoots were amazing. They transported patients all over the camp and were fantastic, and helped us with feeding and all kinds of things. But you can see that the needs are severe. So like this woman here, that we ended up specializing in rehabilitation. She's an external fixator. This is a tinker toy looking thing that goes outside your skin, across and down, and in between that is a very complex fracture that otherwise is floppy and doesn't heal you. So it's a stabilizing device. And when you have one of those, you have to wear it for about 3 months before the bones heal up together enough that you can take it off and put somebody in a regular cast. The problem with these tinker toys is that when they go into your skin, it makes a little highway for the germs to get down into your bones and cause a horrible infection. And if that happens in this situation, you basically amputate. All right, so we had hundreds of post-operative, this is called an X-fix patients, amputated patients that needed prolonged rehab care. What we know from other earthquake disasters is earthquakes, unlike other disasters, cause a really, really high medical burden. If you think of it this way, like in the tsunami, right, the big wave comes and either you were healthy enough to run away and you were fine, or you were washed out to sea and you're dead. There wasn't a lot of medical need left behind. But earthquakes are quite different. In these settings, because of the crushed buildings, there's a lot of complex fractures, the neurosurgical needs early on, and people who need really heavy medical care. And in Pakistan, after the earthquake there, what we knew, Hillary and I, from that experience was that for months and months and months, there are hundreds of people who are just going to be languishing in hospitals. You can't discharge them home. There's nowhere to go. They don't have a home anymore. And if you're using a wheelchair or crutches, you can't move around well enough to take care of yourself. So you need massive amounts of rehabilitation facilities, and that's basically what we were trying to provide here. And we were specifically asking people, because we're setting up one of the better facilities, we thought, given what we knew about security, and we were feeding patients, many others weren't. We were giving them water, many others weren't. That we were asking for people to send us these X-fixes, the amputated patients who have to heal for weeks and weeks before you can even begin to think of fitting them into a prosthesis, and also unaccompanied minors, because we saw a lot of kids who were by themselves, and we felt like we had a good way of taking care of them. So these things just went on and on. We had special wound care teams set up to care for the medical needs. This is an X-ray. This Buzz Lightyear gun-looking thing is actually a veterinary X-ray, and that was donated to us right after the earthquake. So basically, they shoot X-rays, and then we had one teeny tiny X-ray plate that we had to run. We had just one that would go back and forth to a computer. So it was a really laborious thing trying to get X-rays done. Sorry, some of these are medical. These are some pictures of an amputation revision in a little girl. These are inside a classroom building. This is the recovery tent. She's waking up. We actually were able to put this little girl and that other little girl in the tent together. They were both amputees and became fast friends. So this is what we have for pharmacy. Stockroom. More stockroom. One of the problems that we had and other people had was that when you amputated arms, there was nothing to do with them, and no way to dispose of them. In the other facility where we were working first, people were just dumping them in the regular trash bins, and that's not okay. So we eventually had somebody make up, this is an incinerator, a special incinerator. There's a door on the other side and a little smokestack, and this is an incinerator that was particularly made to handle the surgical waste, both solid and liquid waste that we had. These are some of our nurses. These nurses are from two different teams here, because we had all of our nursing teams working together, and we eventually hired Haitian doctors and nurses that actually were imported from Cuba, where they had trained. So we weren't draining the local supply of doctors and nurses, but we imported fresh ones and paid them, and they're going to be the continuity of care down there. And like I said, we were feeding the patients 3 meals a day, which was extraordinarily unusual in a place like that. This is cleaning the operative equipment. So the food was initially provided. These women were hired to cook food en masse, okay? And we had them cooking basically rice, and then we were trying to supplement with milk for the patients who needed to heal their bones. And this is them delivering the food out into the camps. The unaccompanied minors in the camps, we tried to keep them together. in special tents very near us. And then when they were ready to be discharged, we were working with another local orphanage who had a lot of capacity to expand in a very stable structure. There was a school there, a doctor there, and a hospital. And we basically educated the people who ran that place on the fact that you need to take special care of these kids and register them with UNICEF, and they were very interested in that. They said, that's great, and we visited, and they became our unaccompanied minor discharge facility, and they did a fantastic job. But what Brett said was true. It was a big problem. We had one small child, about 7 years old. His name was Stanley, and he had a big problem with his arm and needed to go back to Humanitarian for surgery because they were the only place that could do it. So he was unaccompanied. We arranged for the orphanage to get a mama, a woman to go with him that he knew and trusted. And so we sent Stanley and the mama in the ambulance and took them to Humanitarian. Turns out she returned by herself a day later, and the hospital in Humanitarian that was run by Western physicians who were unfamiliar with child protection wouldn't let her stay with him. So 7-year-old Stanley went in by himself, and it took us a week to find out what had happened to him. We had been transferring him all over the Dominican Republic, medically appropriately, to get him the right surgery, but he was totally by himself. So we had to go find out where he was and fish him back to the proper facility. It was a big problem. The other problem we had was this is the last point, the staff in our place were totally voluntary from a number of different organizations from 13 different countries at the time I left. And they were, for the most part, completely new to disasters and completely unused to doing this kind of work. And fairly reliably, on about day 3, they would have a blowout. I mean, they would blow up, be angry, start yelling, start complaining about things like the amount of litter on the compound and things like that. But it became a big job for the person who was the medical director, which was my job first, and then the people who followed, to kind of calm these people down, because you were constantly being screamed at by somebody who was just losing it in the field, because this is very stressful. It's out of the ordinary for them. You know, they're tired, they've been up all night, there's not a good place to shower, it's not comfortable, and they have just had it by day 3. Then you talk them down out of their tree, and then they're better afterwards. But this was a constant struggle, because a lot of our staff were there for 4 days, or a week or 2, or 2 weeks. There was constant turnover. So this was a daily reality of kind of talking the staff down, and that was something that I think I hadn't really come across before, because of the number of newbies that we had in the field. But it really helped to do 2 things. Everybody got an orientation in which we explained child protection, and explained that nobody was going to leave here with a Haitian child to adopt or anything like that. And we had explained the registration and kind of how it worked. And then we had daily 7 p.m. staff meetings at which we would explain the activities of the day and what donations were coming in and going out, and introduce new people. And that created a sense of community and made it so that we could actually all do our jobs. So if anybody is a medical type person and you're interested, this will be going on for at least 4 to 6 months as we wait for all those X-fixes to heal. So,
particularly if you're a physical therapist or an occupational
yes,
therapist.
physical therapy, occupational therapy, Creole
rehabilitation
speaker,
medicine.
or if you're a psychiatrist, we're going to try to start teaching local people who can understand English and then do this in Creole to do some of the psychiatry work that needs to be done. And then we have a huge lack of those folks.
Could I add one addition to that?
Yeah.
For those of you who aren't medical people, what is often really needed are operational people. People who understand systems, people who understand admin, people who understand sort of relationship building, because there are a lot of doctors that are going down. I mean, there are a lot of doctors, and everybody wants to operate, but no one wants to keep patient logs. No one wants to develop the system for tracking patients. No one wants to put up
wiring.
tents.
If you're an electrician, I have a job for you.
Yeah, exactly. And so your skills are, I mean, if you're like, oh, I'm a political science major, there's not much I can do, that's absolutely not correct. Just an analytic mind and a willingness to act and just do work is hugely important in places like this.
Yeah, we actually, the people who put up most of the tents you saw was one German, he was an air traffic controller who was actually directing a group of, and I won't say the guy's name, but there was a Hollywood movie star guy who came down with some of his Santa Barbara buds, and they said, oh, we're in film, and they wouldn't tell me, and I'd never heard of him. But yeah, the movie star and the air traffic controller put up all those tents in perfectly straight roads, and that was great. So, a lot of people like that.
can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
You're talking about building infrastructure of different kinds so that the organizational stuff can happen more easily. So that the needs are known by people here and there, including people who are going to go there.
Right.
And need to start to get into the right mindset. You're talking about psychiatrists who are going to treat minds and they don't understand the culture.
That's why we're not having our psychiatrists treat the people of Haiti.
Right.
There's going to be an intermediary.
But as you, this is all about capacity building and the infrastructure for capacity building.
Sure.
So I've been fascinated because there's been a lot of requests for money, but little requests for capacity building of the infrastructure type, the informational type, the storytelling type, the type where people here who have particular skills can help remotely solve logistical problems because they airdrop things during World War II.
Right.
Right? So I'm wondering who's putting that together?
Oh, that's a very, very good question.
Do you think,
And a good segue,
I have a suggestion, which is that we have the presentations, we have a question and answer, and we give ourselves about 10 or 15 minutes at the end to actually have people who have concrete suggestions, proposals, recommendations. So one could be to instruct somebody to do a log of all the skills that are needed, and other people will have other ideas. So we actually give ourselves 10 or 15 minutes at the end to be very concrete. So what I would suggest is that we should now just move on, if you don't mind. So we hear everybody who has material to present, and then we move on. Is that okay?
But hold that thought, because it's a really salient point if we move ahead.
It's going to take just a minute.
Let me just comment while Patrick says something for a second. The field hospital, it's a little bit of a segue, yes, doesn't exist in a vacuum, and so one of our goals has been and continues to be to link up with the UN Health Cluster, obviously, with
That was preemptive.
I guess we're ready. For a couple reasons. One is there's data sharing that must take place around a displaced population. So, for instance, just basic surveillance. The other is the building of a nascent Haitian health system, because it is going to be
About what 100 or so volunteers can do with open source technology, this open source software. What Stephanie just ended with in terms of the management was also something we really hit upon, because none of us were managers. We're all doers, and yet we had 200-300 volunteers, and the biggest challenge was actually management. So it resonates a lot, but obviously in Boston, not in Haiti. I just want to give you a sense of what the first 10 days looked like for us, a very just sort of broad overview, give you 3 examples that amongst literally hundreds that will, I think, drive home the point as to how powerful technology and volunteers together can do. How what we ended up working on day and night for the last 4 weeks was connected to the operational response, and then on the ownership and capacity building, a few words on how we see this moving forward. It's interesting, it's all squished. So Newshahidi means witness in Swahili. Newshahidi is a Kenyan organization that was founded about 2 years ago. We're supported by the Midyar network, and we are basically in the business. We're a non-profit tech company is how we describe ourselves, and we develop innovative open source platforms for interactive mapping, for disaster response, for human rights abuses. And that's exactly how we started. We actually started during the post-election violence in Kenya, when we saw that the media couldn't keep up, the mainstream media couldn't keep up with respect to what was being, the human rights abuses that were occurring, and the NGOs weren't sharing data and so on. So we figured, okay, let's put a map up that looks a little like this, except less squished, and let people and witnesses actually report using text messages. So that was about 2 years ago, and since then we've gotten some funding. We've partnered with HHI closely in terms of incubating the project, and this is how it all started in Haiti. About 2 hours after the earthquake, I found out through CNN and immediately called the tech team at Newshahidi and said we really needed to move, that a combination of that kind of magnitude of earthquake and the vulnerability of the population to begin with in Haiti was just going to be a nightmare on many levels. And so we immediately started customizing a platform, and this is what it sort of looks like. Just basically a map of Haiti with some categories that were given to us by UN OCHA, in terms of they told us what it was we should have as indicators to monitor. And what we did, in a way, was do near real-time crisis mapping of the disaster and the humanitarian response in Haiti. And this is a good overview. CNN.
But the standout is a site called Newshahidi. You can click around for yourself at haiti.newshahidi.com, and they place data on interactive charts and timelines, and they say, get this, more than 1,200 texts from within Haiti have been translated and included on this, their interactive map. Each red dot you're seeing there is what they call an incident. So that could be a call for help or perhaps an update on missing people. I read one earlier that said people need water, food, medicine in Martissan. I also saw an SOS for 30 children in a nursery outside the main city. So how do they do it? Well, they have a 10-person staff, but they also rely on partnerships and their network of volunteers throughout Africa, the United States, and Europe. Here, you're seeing volunteers in Boston at Tufts University scouring the web for any leads from both official news sites and social networks. Patrick Meyer talked.
And we've been getting a lot of media attention, which was great to get the word out, and I'm going to explain why that was so important. But about 10 days after the earthquake, Secretary of State Clinton mentioned the work that the technology community, i.e. the technology community and all the volunteers in Boston were doing in terms of setting up these interactive maps. And just to put that into context.
Information networks have also played a critical role on the ground. When I was with President Preval in Port-au-Prince on Saturday, one of his top priorities was to try to get communication up and going. The government couldn't talk to each other, what was left of it, and NGOs, our civilian leadership, our military leadership were severely impacted. The technology community has set up interactive maps to help us identify needs and target resources. And on Monday, a 7-year-old girl and 2 women were pulled from the rubble of a collapsed supermarket by an American search and rescue team after they sent a text message calling for help. Now, these examples are manifestations of a much broader phenomenon. The spread of information networks is forming a new nervous system for our planet.
And this nervous system looks something like this. It's all these information and communication technologies, and the power here is that they're becoming increasingly connected, increasingly integrated, and increasingly interoperable as well. And so if I were to sort of find an analogy for the work that the Fletcher volunteers and others did during the first 30 days, is basically be an organism, be a nerve center within this nervous system, and an organism scouring for information. The minutest reference to Haiti, whether it's on Twitter, whether it's through Skype chats with the search and rescue teams on the ground, whether it's something coming from the radio. We had folks listening to the radio for events that we could then map in real time. So looking across all these different media, whether it's audio, text, visual, and so on, and getting information, aggregating information, and mapping it in such a way that it's actionable within, with specific information needs and coordinates as well. So that obviously required a huge volunteer effort, and we quickly had to become a super organism of volunteers. But this is the Situation Room at Fletcher, and we had our alumni in Washington, D.C., as well as some colleagues in Montreal and in Geneva and in London set up their own Situation Rooms to basically help us monitor this vast amount and growing amount of information, basically trying to consume all this information that was available on the web in near real time in order to map it so that the humanitarian community could have access to it. So what we had to do was not only manage sort of the first all-volunteer global disaster response Situation Room and get very little sleep, but actually scale up as quickly as we could because the information was exploding as well, and provide trainings, ongoing and repeated trainings on the side as we were trying to basically map these text messages that were coming from people trapped under the rubble. So it was a huge volunteer effort, and as I noted, a lot of volunteers from all around the world who set up their own little Situation Rooms and basically, ran with what they needed to do in order to help. So 3 quick examples that this kind of combination of volunteers and technology can do. Taking Twitter, as I mentioned, we were looking at and browsing. So one of our volunteers came across this tweet by this woman who was basically talking about a pharmacy or drugstore being reopened in Rue Lamar, which is in Pétionville. This is actionable information, it's important information that people might want to know on the ground. So what we do now, this didn't exist before, but we've partnered with OpenStreetMap to basically develop an address book for Haiti and allow us to match addresses to GPS coordinates, because the humanitarian community doesn't work with addresses, they work with GPS coordinates. That's the language, that's the currency. It was incredible, perhaps not surprising though, that during the first 10 days, how much of Port-au-Prince was unmapped. You just had blank streets that had absolutely no names, even main streets, whether it was in Google Earth or Google Maps or what have you. It was incredible. We've been able to now, populate this database so that we can actually go into this and more often than not get GPS coordinates. So you just go to that and say type in Rue Lamar and you get results. In this particular example, the fourth result on the bottom is the one that corresponds to Pétionville. And you don't see, but right below here there's some GPS coordinates just like there are right here. And so that gives us a sense, okay, now we have an idea where Rue Lamar actually is. And the next step is basically you go back to the Newshahidi platform, which as I mentioned is open public domain, and submit the incident. This is what it looks like when you submit an incident. You have a report title, you see the lat longs, hopefully, if it's not too bright, and you tag the information accordingly. This is what it then looks like. You have the pharmacy open, we translate it into English. Here you have the reference. We actually put the reference to the actual URL of that particular tweet, so that people later on can trace it back. Where did this information in fact come from to begin with? And it requires more detective work. We knew where Rue Lamar was now, but where was this exact pharmacy? This is where the Haitian diaspora come in. They've been spending hours and hours with us in the Situation Room behind big screens, helping us map downtown Port-au-Prince and Haiti in general. I mean, they're the experts. And in fact, last week we had a chap who was a former taxi driver, right? Like, perfect godsend. Like, he knew exactly where all these roads were. So we're able to identify some of these areas thanks to them and thanks to, believe it or not, Lonely Planet. It's not a plug-in for Lonely Planet, but Lonely Planet has been very helpful for some years. One of my favorite examples is this one. Colleagues of ours with a tech organization, humanitarian organization called Instead. And right here on your right, you have a colleague, Eric Rasmussen, who's sitting under this tent, literally, I think, pitched in a youth salon.
Eric went to all the cluster meetings and stood up and said, everybody text Newshahidi at 4636 and you can do this, and people were like, you sure what? But he did great, and a lot of the community, I think, started to use it because of that, a lot of the NGOs.
We owe him a lot of thanks. And so here's I think just near the tarmac of the airstrip in Port-au-Prince International Airport, and he's Skyping with us live in snowy Boston. And this has gone on for days and days and days. And basically what he did in this example was he gave us references to 7 really obscure locations to try and identify GPS coordinates for it, because there were reports that there were individuals trapped at these locations. And the search and rescue teams, SAR, were going to go back out at 0600 the next morning to try and search for survivors. Anna Schultz, who's a fellow PhD candidate at the Fletcher School, didn't really use Google Earth before the disaster, apart from maybe looking at her house. She's now become, and I'm not exaggerating, a world-class expert in satellite imagery analysis, so much so that she's being recruited by 3-letter agencies. No joke whatsoever. So Anna has been our point person to basically provide geolocation support to a number of organizations, a number of projects, including the search and rescue operations. She was able to find the first 6 of 7, but the 7th was a real headache. All we had to go by was Un Bon Prix, not to be confused with Au Bon Pain, but Un Bon Prix near Napoleon Hotel. And we had no idea, there was no extra information that Eric had that he could possibly give us to let us know what in the world Un Bon Prix was to begin with, or where the Napoleon Hotel was located. So we decided to try out a bit of crowdsourcing and a bit of luck, and we sent out a tweet on the Newshahidi Twitter feed and said, SOS, Mayday, anybody have any information about where Un Bon Prix happens to be, or the Napoleon, please get in touch with us. About an hour later, somebody submitted this particular incident or report on the Newshahidi platform. It's the same web form that you saw for the pharmacy. And what they did is they copied and pasted our tweet, so obviously they saw our tweet, and said, well, I can't find Un Bon Prix, but Napoleon happens to be connected with the Holiday Inn, and here's the address of Napoleon Hotel. It's on Rue Capois numéro 10. So all of a sudden we were one step closer, and this was really crowdsourcing at its best, right? We're sending out an SOS to the World Wide Web in many respects, and somebody replies to us within an hour saying, I found a clue. So it's a lot of detective work. So we're one step closer. We tell Anna. Anna says, okay, look for Napoli Inn and Holiday Inn stuff in Lonely Planet. No luck in Lonely Planet sort of this time around, but we also had access to very high-resolution satellite imagery within 24 hours of the earthquake, which is completely unprecedented. If you think of the 2004 tsunami, it took 10 days, 12 days, to get high-resolution satellite imagery released to us by the big companies who own the imagery. This was within 24 hours, completely unprecedented. And we also had, we were the first civilians to be given access to UAV imagery, so the military had drones who were flying around. It was very important to get us 3D imagery, and if Anna were here, she would explain to you why one of those was really important, to find a little road that was winding into the mountains, which we could not have seen on sort of a 2D type setup. But she basically reasoned that the only swimming pool along this road, which was actually this one, must belong to the Holiday Inn in downtown Port-au-Prince. No other building would have that. So now we actually had the GPS coordinates for the Napoli Inn hotel, but we still didn't know what Au Bon Prix was. At 1 a.m. in the morning, we got a tweet back from the World Wide Web, complete stranger, who somehow had managed to track down an individual who had been a former employee of Un Bon Prix, which happened to be a bookshop in downtown Port-au-Prince. She found his CV online, gave us his name, Marc-Henri Louis, where he lived in Brooklyn, and his cell phone number, right? Unreal, you know, especially if you've gone through like 4 days of no sleep. You're kind of thinking to yourself, you've got to be joking.
We can't call anybody you want to know.
No, but he actually answered on the second ring, so he was hopefully up. And with a mix of French and Creole and English, indeed, he was a former employee. He now works for Swissport at JFK, and told us exactly where his former site of employment was. And we were then able to tweet that back, say thank you very much to this complete stranger. We've got the location, and we were able to Skype back to Eric Rasmussen on the ground and give him a much better sense as to where that particular Un Bon Prix was, which obviously had collapsed and had trapped individuals. So pretty insane when you think that our Situation Room was first in my living room in snowy Boston, and we're communicating with these folks, you know, on the tarmac of Port-au-Prince Airport. It's kind of unreal, and it goes to show you the power that technology and crowdsourcing can have. So much so that even Pam Meteor said, I love it, which is always good when your donor says that. Perhaps the most spectacular and unprecedented, even after this story that I want to share here with you is the SMS, and this is, I'm closing soon. There are various ways you can communicate need during, you can't see this for live view, but in humanitarian response. This is just basically a piece of cloth that's put on a stone, and people saying we need assistance, we need water, and so on. But we have technology, just like as Secretary Clinton was referring to. So we worked very closely with Instead, Eric Rasmussen, the Thomson Reuters Foundation, as well as the State Department, who have been incredible. They've gone above and beyond so many times to set up a free short code, a free text message number that anybody inside Haiti can text for free with their location and urgent needs, and we then receive that. And the story, in terms of how this gets from somebody's phone in Haiti to us and into the humanitarian responders, is quite remarkable. Because if you, an example is, we had a text message about an orphanage that was running out of water. So if somebody sends us, this is obviously in Creole, the vast majority of text messages we get are in Creole or French. We managed to work with the National Union of Haitian Workers in the United States to mobilize 10,000 Haitian workers to translate the incoming text messages in near real time, literally between 1 minute, and we have a couple of Fletcher volunteers here as well, they can vouch for it, between 1 minute to 10 minutes of them receiving a text message from a mobile phone in Haiti. They've got it translated, and we have it. So it's really, really near real time. We get that information, then our volunteers identify the address, exactly where is this particular orphanage, this is GPS coordinates, we structure it, we approve it, and we map it, and we categorize it. This has to do with lack of water. So we tag these incoming text messages so it becomes easier for the responders to actually sort of sort through. You're not going to see this, but this is a sneak peek from what Newshahidi looks like under the hood, and I guess I can't really show this example if it's that weird, but so a few days ago we had received, or mapped rather, about 2,500 events here we don't see it, but we had received about 14,000 text messages. If you press the SMS button, you get the list right here of all the text messages coming in. And this is an example that you can't see, but basically, I'll quickly summarize. You get a text message in Creole, you press read more, that gives you the English translation, and then what you can do is, if the text message that's come in does not have sufficient information on location, which prevents us from actually mapping it, and it happens to be an urgent text message, from right here, we can reply to that individual. And we have preset settings, such as in English say, thanks for the information, can you give us more details about the location? Or we can actually press the Creole version, and it's automatically there, and then we press send, and that text message goes directly back to the individual who sent that text message in the first place. So completely unprecedented in terms of scale of bidirectional information sort of sharing and communication between the disaster-affected population and volunteers in Boston who are helping to get this information out to the humanitarian community. So that's basically the story of how a dot appears on the Newshahidi website. And our volunteers got carried away, so we needed to try and have different kinds of visualizations. And just to tell you now very quickly how the operational response works. These organizations are tracking the Newshahidi feed, because what we do is, what we've started to do now is only map the most urgent and actionable messages. So that's sort of one of the added values that we bring, is that we've already done the triage part and geolocated it with specific GPS coordinates. So we didn't actually reach out to any of these organizations because we didn't have the time. They actually came to us, which we were equally surprised. I mean, all of us were, why in the world is, for example, the USS Benson aircraft carrier off the coast of Haiti emailing us, right? Well, because within 12 hours to 24 hours, we just had the most comprehensive, up-to-date, near real-time map of Haiti. Because we had 200, 100, 300 volunteers at the end of the day, about a week ago, on a Google group list, who were helping to basically scavenge through the World Wide Web for this information. And just to give you some feedback that we received, for example, the Marine Corps sent us an email a few days ago. I'm going to just quickly read it. I cannot overemphasize to you what the work of Newshahidi Haiti has provided. It is saving lives every day. I wish I had the time to document to you every example, but there are simply too many and our operation is moving too quickly, too fast. And later in the email, he actually says, he gave us an example of the 22nd Marine Expeditionary Unit going out to save 3 individuals based on a report that we mapped on Newshahidi. And then he says, verbatim, I can vouch that there are hundreds of examples of this actually happening since we started. And should I finish up? 2 minutes? Task Force said the same thing. We even had the second individual call us up in the Situation Room to give us a bit of a pep talk and said, if you need psychological counseling, we can provide it to you, because he was obviously knowing what he was talking about. We didn't expect that we were actually going to be this connected and this emotionally impacted by the text messages. But he basically told us, no matter what anyone tells you, just keep mapping, keep doing what you're doing, and it's saving lives. And colleagues at OFDA have said the same thing, that it's been incredibly helpful to a lot of what they've been doing. And so what we've done is we've tried to customize the platform to make it even more useful for these humanitarian responders. Here what you can do is you can specify and basically subscribe to these alerts by text message or by email. And you can specify the area. So if I'm working in Delmas, and let's say I have my office in Delmas, I can actually specify with a circle the radius that I want information coming from. So if I'm in this little UN office and I want a 5-kilometer radius of any alerts that come in, I get that text message in real time. And they can also save their WFP. They can subscribe to alerts that specifically have to do with food. So the idea is to provide these agencies with exactly the kind of actionable, real-time information that really matter to them, not flood them with all kinds of information that they can actually use. So that's something we did. We've also provided an actionable and action taken tab. I'll skip this very quickly. We had the second in command at Northcom basically change the schedule to hang out with us for half an hour and basically let us know that we're doing a great job and to give up the good work. We got awarded the Award for Excellence. The things that happen when you start volunteering and stuff is incredible. And then the forward part, which is something that I just want to get to, we're working very closely with the Haitian diaspora, because at the end of the day, our goal at Newshahidi at the Fletcher School is to ensure that this project becomes a fully Haitian-run, Haitian-owned, Haitian-managed initiative. We're scaling up our capacity building activities with the Haitian diaspora. They're incredibly eager to take this on. They've obviously got a strong emotional connection. They've got a lot of links. And they know their country a million times better than any of us will. And the next step we want to do, we have a full-time Haitian volunteer on the ground, Newshahidi volunteer, and what we really want to do is repeat a project that we did in Kibera with OpenStreetMap called Map Kibera, because the most vulnerable communities in I think, and I'm not an expert in Haiti, but are going to be some of these communities in the slums. And it's actually, if you look at the map, even the Newshahidi map of Haiti, there's a big gap where like Kafufaya is, right? Because we're not getting text messages from that, because maybe they don't really know, but if they do and they send us a text message, we don't know how to geolocate it, because the little shortcuts in the slums are not mapped. We don't have a name for them, but we know from the Haitian diaspora that even the smallest little 2-meter shortcut in the slums has a name. So that's one of our sort of biggest sort of hopes right now, is to start working in a participatory way, just like we did it with Map Kibera, to allow the communities to basically map themselves on the map, which can then basically put themselves on the radar of the humanitarian community, which is really important. What's really interesting is that now people actually think that Newshahidi is actually Newshahidi, which we're all for. We're absolutely all for. A plug for HHI, we co-organized the first conference last year. This is the second conference, going to happen in October. Stay tuned for more information. And I'm just going to leave you with this short 2-minute video.
So remarkable. I mean, Newshahidi as an African innovation. You know, here we are, at least I am, in Washington, D.C., using this innovation coming from Africa to try to help people in Haiti and leveraging volunteers all around the world. I mean, it's really a flattened world. And so as we started to work together, I'm realizing here's a great example of ordinary people together doing an extraordinary thing.
We had an urgent request for a school near Carrefour, hundreds of trapped children. The SAR team had originally been sent out by UN Dispatch. They got into the location and realized it was a wrong location, and I ended up being able to give them an extremely accurate location, and a SAR team made it out, and they managed to rescue some of the children that were trapped in that. I'm mapping the relief, but it's really hard and totally heartbreaking to be reading these messages. It's literally life and death situations. People are dying, and the faster you can get people onto the ground, the faster you can get them help. And that's one of the reasons why I'm still here, because it feels like we're really making a difference, and that's what the people on the ground are telling us.
So thanks for your patience and letting me share this story that all these volunteers have been engaged in.